Now, perfect.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome again today. Thank you for joining us. My name is Lee Merriweather, and I'm a proud AARP Houston volunteer. AARP is the nation's largest nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to empowering people like myself, 50 and older, to choose how we're going to live as we age. AARP Houston is dedicated to providing resources and information to those caring for their loved ones. And with over 3.4 million caregivers in Texas alone, AARP Houston is proud to sponsor Mindful Mondays, a caregiver series in partnership with Caregiver Wellness Retreat. AARP has prepared to care resource guides designed to help develop and implement a caregiving plan for a loved one or friend. The guides include ways to assess your loved one's needs, tips for organizing essential documents, and of course, information on caring for yourself, checklists, medication charts, and also contact lists. Visit aarp.org/caregiving to download your guide. And I'll put this information in the chat. You can also visit aarp.org/Houston for more virtual events and resources in your community. And again, I will put the information in the chat. And again, I will say happy Valentine's Day and thank you for joining us today.
All right. So thank you so much for taking your time to volunteer, Lee. I really appreciate that. And helping us organize this and keeping me in line. It's really, really helpful. So thank you so much, Lee. And yeah, perfect. So I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to go ahead, So if you're not muted, go ahead and mute yourself unless you'd like to say something. You know that you can also turn your screen off if you like. I'm actually pinned. So when we have this recording later, it'll just be me on the recording, not necessarily you. So if you're concerned about that, you can also communicate through the chat. And periodically I'll kind of check in with you. And I definitely want this to be an opportunity for you to share as well. So keeping that in mind. And then one other housekeeping note, and I mentioned this earlier, if you joined us earlier, and I'll put this in the chat box, that's my email address, caregiversretreatinfo@gmail.com. And so you want to make sure that you add us as a contact. And if you do that, then you'll get all of the follow-up information. So you'll get the link from the recording from today, and I'll also send last time's recording, as well as anything that I share. I always try to add a little bit of that as well. So if you haven't, and I don't think many of us have today, just checked in through the chat box, you might go ahead and add where you're zooming in from. And I'd love to know what you're feeling today, as in an emotion. So if you're feeling happy, sad, tired, for me, that's an emotion. Sometimes tired is content, sometimes tired is frustrated, sometimes tired is lethargic. So however those kinds of things show up for you. So if you can put in the chat maybe where you're zooming from, and if you have an emotion that you're experiencing, and it can be today or this morning, or even this week. So I am actually in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I will claim it. I am a Texan. I grew up actually in Dallas, and I've lived in Houston, in various parts of Houston, and at different times of my adult life. And I feel really grateful to be connected with AARP because they enable us to do this kinds of things and offer these at no cost to you. So today, I know it's a tough topic. It's resiliency through grief. And so I'm curious, you can either put your hand up if you have your picture, or you can put in the chat box or raise your hand. Who has experienced any kind of grief this year. So from January to now, it's only been a month. Yeah. And then maybe through December or any time last year. So it might encompass a few more of you. Yeah. So today we'll share a little bit more about grief and working through the resiliency of that. But we're going to do just a little bit of a recap of last week as well. So I'm going to share my screen here. Oops. We're not going to check in just yet. We're going to start from the beginning. All right. Yeah. So resiliency within grief. So looking at how it impacts our well-being. And I think sometimes grief is one of those really kind of a taboo subject. I wish that we actually had classes on grief, growing up or even as adults. Grief is something that we don't really talk about until we actually experience it usually. So last week we did a little introduction of mindfulness. And if you weren't here with us, I'll encourage you to hop back and just get some of those basic skills, or even just recap and review. I think it's a great way to kind of take a couple of handfuls of exercises that are really helpful. So mindfulness essentially is that awareness that arises through paying attention, and it's on purpose in the present moment and without judgment. Seems like a really tall order. The definition that I gave last week in terms of mindfulness was that moment in which we recognize something and then we hit that pause button, and then we're able to choose to either react or respond. And so I don't know about you, but I would much rather have a response than a reaction. A reaction is often like something that pops up, that emotion that maybe you put in that chat box. Some of you are feeling content, others of you are not. And so it's that recognizing that emotion, and then what do we do with that emotion? How do we be in the world with that? We're actually going to just begin with a really simple exercise that I call who breathing. And so you can do this however you are, it's just perfect. Breathing is one, like if you were to look at mindfulness as like this giant circle or bucket, and you put lots of things in the bucket. So breathing could be in the bucket, meditation could be in the bucket, types of movement or somatic movement could even be exercise that are in that mindfulness bucket. Could just be awareness. We're going to talk about many other types of mindfulness tools today. But if you can really just look at this as one aspect. So some of you may or may not resonate with a breathing exercise. And so if for any reason modulating the breath actually makes you feel more anxious, and for some people it does, then I might suggest that you focus on a tactile part of yourself. So you could either take your fingers and rub them together, you could rub your hands on your lap as we do this breathing exercise, or simply feel your feet on the ground. And so those kinds of things are what we call a grounding exercise. And so sometimes breath might make you feel a little bit out there, then this might help you bring yourself back to your center. So however you would like to do that is perfect. So you can have the eyes, if you will, maybe just slightly off your screen. So we look at the screens quite a bit. If you've never checked your screen time on your phone as a reality check, highly recommend it, because I'm always surprised at how often I'm picking up and looking at it. So eyes just slightly off if you can. Feel your feet against the ground. And if it's comfortable, you could close the eyes, or you could just lower them slightly as a gaze. And no need to change the breath in any way. So just notice it. See if you can shift your inhalation through the nose, if you can, And then allow your expiration of breath to be out through the mouth. Doesn't matter the length of time, just simply breathing in through the nose and breathing out through the mouth. You might notice that the duration of the breath begins to shift or change just as you're paying attention to it. You might notice that as you breathe out or exhale through the mouth, and it might feel like it wants to be a sigh. And again, breathing in. And so we're going to change this just a little bit. As you breathe out through the mouth, imagine that you're trying to blow a candle or maybe a feather in front of you. So it's in through the nose, and as you breathe out through the mouth, it's almost as if you are whispering the word who, W-H-O. And it's silent. Breathing in through the nose. Breathing out as if you were saying the word who, W-H-O. And let's take one more round together. You can release that pattern, but just continue to breathe in and out. And just observe what you notice about the breath now. Does it feel a little different? Is it longer, smoother? And then go just a little bit deeper underneath that, and you might notice perhaps that there is a shift in how your emotion was at the beginning to now. And if there's no change, that's perfect. But just notice. And when you're ready, you can bring your eyes and your attention back. I'm curious how that felt for you. You can either unmute or you can add it in the chat box if you'd like to add. You can keep it simple. One word. Relaxing. This is a good question. Is it okay if nothing changed, or why is it okay if nothing changed? Well, because I think there are different lengths of time in which people feel sort of that visceral change. And also some of us have more difficulty feeling, right, that inner landscape, or what we call interoception. So it could take a little bit more time. It could take a little more practice. And it's also okay to just not feel a change and to notice what that's like, to not experience something different. And just the act of noticing, right, creates a pause and can actually create a physiological change without you knowing. One of the benefits to actually doing that particular exercise, right, is it's directly connected and related to what we would call parasympathetic response in the body. And so you probably may or may not heard of that. And we'll talk a little bit more about the nervous system in one of our future sessions together. But the parasympathetic part of our nervous system is that part that calms us down. It's the part that sometimes is called rest and digest. And it's balanced with what we call the sympathetic nervous system. The easiest way to think about it is, let's all take a breath in together and lift your shoulders. So inhale, that's sympathetic. Exhale, parasympathetic. Inhale, enlivening. Exhale, relaxing. One more time. Inhale, waking up. Exhale, calming. So we can actually modulate or change our breath based on what we need. So I think it's sometimes assumptive of us to think that we always need to be calmed down. So, right? Have you ever told an angry person to calm down, and how successful were you with that? Probably not, right? But if we think about the breath as really more of a marriage, right? The inhalation is just as important as the expiration of breath. And when we inhale, that's enlivening. It's part of the nervous system that actually wakes you up. So if you ever notice when you are starting to feel lethargic, if you increased your inhalation, even if it's just a beat or two longer, your energy will also increase. If we increase our expiration of our breath, you might notice that it's a little bit more calming. It's a really quick, very simplistic way to think about the nervous system, but it's one of the most powerful things that you can learn or even teach someone else. So if that resonates at all with you today, one way to help remember that breathing technique is to share it with someone else. So if you're willing to consider sharing that with someone else today, you'll probably remember it and begin to apply it. So we'll take a look at a couple of, you're welcome, Bridget. We'll take a look at a couple of attitudes toward mindfulness. And this is really our theme for today, this idea of accepting. And acceptance is an active process. It's not passive at all. And we often think of acceptance as forgiveness, and they are not synonymous, I would say. Acceptance is really, in terms of mindfulness, not arguing with reality. So it's that idea that, we want to control things and we want to have, some of us are planners, and planning is a way of, right, decreasing anxiety, a way of giving us acceptance of a particular situation. But what happens when something comes in and rocks our boat, right? Can we still have acceptance toward it? So it's that idea of, we talked about last week, of equanimity and not arguing with reality. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into what grief is and how grief and acceptance work together, sort of hand in hand. And I think pretty much every one of you mentioned that you've experienced some kind of grief this year alone, or maybe even all of last year. One of my favorite definitions is grief is love with nowhere to go. And we often don't think about or think that love and grief are opposite or sometimes incongruent. But actually, because we have this capacity to care for something, whether we use the word love or not, it could just be a deep caring for. That is how grief manifests itself. Another way to think about grief is the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or the change in a familiar pattern of behavior. What I think is so interesting about grief itself, in terms of looking at it from a much broader picture and a perspective. And for me, it really shifted when I looked at grief as this idea of loss. How many of you have ever lost an item or something that is important to you? Yeah, I was thinking the other day that I have this piece of jewelry that I have lost, and it was so important and meaningful to me. And I actually think about it quite often. It was a gift, and wore it on a very, very special occasion. And I still have this strong tethering and attachment to it. And so loss can be really anything along those lines. One of my favorite, and I'll put this in your notes, it's called the Grief Recovery Handbook. A number of years ago, as I was struggling with the loss of my stepmom, who had early onset Alzheimer's, she she passed away a number of years ago, but watching the grief of my father continue even after her loss was something that I grappled with as well. So how do I reconcile that ambiguous grief that I felt, which comes with Alzheimer's? And also, how do I support and comfort and be with my dad, who is still experiencing this kind of grief? And this particular book and this process was so helpful to me. Some of the ways in which we define grief are also really helpful to have a really good understanding of it. And if you have a piece of paper, I'd love for you to jot down. So I have just a Post-it note handy. I'm going to do a little bit of kind of brainstorming here, just a little to get the idea of how far reaching this is. When you think about grief and loss, it could be, and you can jot any of these down, and you could do it by a word or a date, however it makes sense for you, or a name, a death of a pet, moving. I was sharing with Lee that I have moved every 3 years of my adult life. And with moving has come many gains in my life, like new neighborhoods, new wonderful restaurants, new friendships, but also the loss of previous friendships. Some friends just really aren't the kinds of friends that can maintain long distance relationships. And I have grieved so many of those throughout my life. Starting something can also precipitate a loss. So, for example, many of you during the pandemic have maybe had a career or had something that you did and that left you, or you had to do what the big word is right now, pivot and change. So that kind of change can also be a type of loss. The death of a spouse, a loved one, a grandparent, a child. Even marriage can be a type of loss, like, right? The loss of your singlehood, the change of how you defined your identity before you got married, or a divorce, a severing or a separation. An end of something, like an end of an addiction, a start of something, as I mentioned earlier, can also be. So if something was lost and there's a change in that, you might be grieving how you were before. Major health changes. I actually went through something, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of frozen shoulder, but yeah, I actually had bilateral. So I had both shoulders that were frozen, which meant I couldn't lift my arms. I couldn't change my shirt. I couldn't, do a lot of things that I really took for granted. And that kind of loss, if you've ever had an injury or a knee injury or a foot injury or not been able to walk like you normally do, even something as, I know it sounds silly, just cutting your finger, right? You can't make dinner like you did before, until it heals. So there are these types of losses that I think we gloss over. Financial changes, retirement, empty nest, or changes in your family dynamics of those living with you or moving in and out of home. And another one which is big today is Valentine's Day, holidays. So holidays can often trigger a reminder of a sense of loss. They can also trigger a sense of belonging as well, though. So as these ideas of loss, if you jotted a few down, I'm going to mention one or two more that were kind of big ones for me that I've kind of learned and adapted through. One is a loss of trust. I had a relationship that shifted and changed, and it really shook me because the integrity of truth was missing. And so this loss of trust was a big one in that relationship. And I would also say, besides I mentioned earlier, a necklace that was really special and important to me. So this idea of things, losing things can be a loss. And last, I will say aging. I think we're in a society in which really prizes this idea of not dying, of living longer. I overheard a conversation yesterday. I went to go swimming, and these women were chatting in the room, and they're like, we're just living too long. And I'm like looking around going, are they really having this conversation? But they were grappling with a loved one that was ill and just continuously getting ill and no longer had consciousness. And so they were struggling with this idea of, are we living too long if the quality of life isn't there for this particular loved one? And it really struck me that we just live in this society that really prizes, right, youth and being able to do that. And I think there is, right, a middle path toward that. So if you've made your list, then next to some of those, and you could just pick one or two, add an emotion or feeling next to it. So for me, next to my moving, I would have sadness, maybe anger, because there was a lack of closure in some cases. Next to my grandmother, I actually would probably put the word serendipity. That was my grandmother's favorite word. And I miss her like crazy. But when I think of her, it's actually not with sadness, it's with warmth. It's every time I see the word serendipity, like I get a little ping of joy, and it's that hormone of serotonin. So it doesn't always have to be, those emotions in which we think. And let's just do a quick reflection here for a moment. You can take your eyes just slightly off the screen, or you can keep a low gaze if you like. Try to put both feet on the floor if that's comfortable for you, or at least connect the hands toward the body, relaxing the shoulders down for a moment. So maybe just reflect on one of these losses, changes, griefs. Maybe not picking the hardest one, but one in which you feel comfortable with in this moment right now. Imagine placing it into your hands. So it could just be placing the word or the idea of it. Or if it's a loved one, you could imagine holding their hand or being present with them. And that emotion that arrived for you, just noticing that. Sometimes articulating the feeling isn't always easy. There's so many emotions we can feel with loss. They range from types of sadness, could be discouragement arriving, a gloominess that arrives. Could be impatient with our grief. We could also be confused by our grief, or we can feel comfortable with it, tranquil even, touched, safe, loving. And if there is a certain part of the body that you might feel it, and if you don't, it's okay. Sometimes those places arrive for us in between the head and the pelvis. So it could be in the throat. Maybe you notice a tightening around the heart or chest. A lightness in the belly or a heaviness in the belly. You might have noticed that your body became more stiff, or you might have noticed that your body became more relaxed. And then we'll just toggle a moment back to that WHO breathing that we did earlier. So breathing in through the nose and lightly breathing out through the mouth as if we were just going to blow on a flame, not to blow it out, but just to see it flicker. And do a few more rounds just like that. Okay, last one. And when you're ready, you can gently open the eyes. We're going to make one more column in this little list, informal list that we're making. Can you think of one way today, this week, or this month that you could honor that grief? And if you're not sure, it's okay. You kind of just circle it, or circle the word, or circle whatever you wrote down, or put a star by it. But if there's something that comes to mind, a way that you could honor. Now, honoring comes in many forms. It could come in the form of just being with it, making a date with it, making a date with your grief, going on a walk with it. It could also be a ritual. So some of us like to, you could have a certain special dish that you prepare, that you make, and the smell and the aroma might remind you of that person that you're missing, as a way to honor them. It could be to read one of your favorite poems or a favorite book, or to see a favorite movie. If anyone has any ideas of how they would honor or ritualize or memorialize their loss, and you'd like to share that with us, you could unmute, or you could type that into the chat box.
I just lost my cousin last week, and the family is in another city. There's not going to be any services, so forth. So it's timely, because right before this session started, I got a text from his niece, and she talked about they're going to just have a very tiny little gathering. And I'm going to be at the ocean this week, serendipitously, and I decided I was going to do something there, just for myself and to remember him, and probably to bring along my earbuds and my phone and listen to some of the music he liked. So
That's beautiful. Thank you, Jill, for sharing that. I love that. Those sensory things that bring back the memories, or that honor. So the ritual of cooking and smelling, or listening to music, or being in a particular place and experiencing nature, maybe where that evokes those memories for you as a place of honoring. That's beautiful. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. So there's a lot of myths about grief, and perhaps you've heard that, or perhaps you haven't. I think oftentimes we, until we've experienced it, we tend to go and work with grief how we were taught to work with grief, or not taught to. So if your family has sort of a ritual around grief, or maybe they ignore it or stuff it down or say, don't cry. So a lot of times our beliefs come from, right, what we've experienced in the past with people that are around us most. And generally that's our family, or those that we live with, or maybe how our parents dealt with grief or did not deal with grief. So oftentimes there are timelines put on it or expectations, and we don't always meet those expectations. One of the beautiful ways that I have learned through grief is not to allow myself to say, well, I should be, right? The shoulds and the oughts. I should be finished with this by now. And yet I instead look at it, well, how can I be with it until eventually it takes up less and less of my emotional energy, so that grief is able to be transformed into something that maybe is still a part of me, and yet it doesn't consume me. So I think that grief necessarily, it's kind of like the parable that we read last week, where when you pour salt, right, into a glass, and it is salt water when you drink it. But when you pour it into a river, right, it's dispersed all the way through. And if you can think of grief more as a river, it's going to ebb and flow. You're going to have eddies to it. You're going to get stuck at times. Other times where it's going to be like a torrent and it carries you down. And other times it'll be like a lazy river where you can lie and look up at the sky and the sun and the stars, or whichever time of day it is for you. So there's different ways in which we can experience it. The types of grief, we've gone over quite a few of those, and I think there are more formalized, pathologized types of grief. For example, there's complicated grief, there's complex grief, there's ambiguous grief, disenfranchised grief, there's collective grief, traumatic grief. And I think those definitions are useful to give us some language around the type of grief we might experience. But most importantly, it comes down to our belief of the grief, how we experience it within ourselves. So less important in terms of defining it in a pathologizing way, but more important, how are we experiencing it in our lives? How is it showing up for us? We did a grief timeline, and we talked about how to memorialize it. So I'd like to just take a moment to look at the screen now, and sunflowers are my favorite, and share this story with you. But let's just take a moment to look at the screen here. Let your eyes kind of dance around it. If there is a color that stands out to you, or even if the background stands out to you. Can you notice any details that maybe you didn't see at first glance? And then take a moment to notice how you feel when you're just noticing the simplicity of a flower. We did a mindful looking last week, and just noticing how you feel right now at this moment. Did anyone take an opportunity to do any mindful looking after last week's session? Or do you maybe notice that you do that already? It's so rare though, right? I was thinking about my son and I were driving somewhere, and he's pulling up a map with Google, and then he puts on music, right? So we're so busy, even like in the car. I can't even remember when I was a kiddo, I would stare out the window. I don't know. It was like the time to daydream. There wasn't a phone to fiddle with. There wasn't, all of these things to be distracted with. So just fascinating to me how little we spend just daydreaming and enjoying. I'm going to share my screen again. Let's see. So that is actually a type of art, which is paper cutting. And the artist is Mary Delaney. And I'm going to zoom in. This one's a little bit better. You can kind of see a little bit more detail, I hope. I'm going to zoom in even further. And so by looking more closely, you can actually see the individual paper cuts and the placement. Mary has a really interesting story. So she grew up in the 1700s. When she was 17, she was a part of an arranged marriage, actually, in the UK, and had to marry a man quite a bit older than her. She wasn't married very long, and she became a widower. It was a really difficult marriage for her, but becoming a widower at this time was actually kind of, in the 1700s, a lucky thing, because a widower could actually do, I'm going to pull up another part to the leaf, kind of do what she wanted to do. She could take up art, she could take up different things, and she enjoyed needlework and drawing and painting. She eventually remarried, and the man that she married, Mr. Delaney, had a garden. And many years later, when he passed, she was the first woman to actually take up this kind of artwork. So this idea of decoupage and paper cutting. And she was in her 70s. She went to live with a friend, and a few years later, this friend passed away. And around the age of 85, she was recognized by the British government, and her artwork went into the British Museum at the age of 85. I think her story is extraordinary for several reasons. Clearly, a woman who continued to remake herself in a time of, right, it's the American Revolution, the age of the Declaration of Independence, a time where, women did sort of handiwork if they had the means to, but certainly didn't quite have the freedom that Mary did as a widower. And the amount of loss that she had, and how she continuously transformed herself over and over and over again. It's really quite extraordinary. I'll take just one more moment to maybe perhaps appreciate, right? She would have been in her mid to late 70s here, creating these really intricate details. In fact, they were so detailed that they were recognized by horticulturists as examples and exemplary examples of different species of flowers. So when we think about the attitude of mindfulness, acceptance, and remember again, acceptance is not passive. It is not congruous necessarily to forgiveness, but it is this idea of being, I love this. Someone said to me the other day, I said, how are you feeling about this? And they said, well, I have some okayness. Okayness, it's this just being all right with what is. So try to imagine the depth of patience that Mary had for those flowers, and to be able to see so finely. Mindfulness also has a similar attribute. And it's, of course, a form of wisdom. Having a beginner's mind, the ability to open yourself up to something new, something fresh. What can you have a beginner's mind about in terms of your grief right now? How can you experience that with a sense of openness and curiosity? Trust is inherent in mindfulness. We don't necessarily equate trust with this idea of being mindful, but it has to do with embodiment. When we are willing to trust our own body and the messages it conveys to us, we increase our awareness. And when we have our own self-trust, right, we can build a bridge toward others. Non-striving, really a tricky one, because I think sometimes we think, well, I need to get this right. Well, you don't actually. Mindfulness is really just simply about a practice and a releasing or letting go. There is an element of gratitude to mindfulness, and when we experience grief, gratitude is not an easy one. And so if on that piece of paper that you have, if you can write the word gratitude just somewhere near your loss, and it may not meet you today, but as we talked about earlier, those really intense emotions begin to shift and change. And how does it change for you? Does it tempt you toward that idea of gratitude? Does something shift inside you, even a sense of generosity, perhaps? I want to do one more, we'll finish off with one more exercise today called self-holding. And I'll stop share. So you can have your feet however you are. And again, I am assumptive that you have the ability to raise your hands. And if that isn't where you are today, you can simply imagine it. It doesn't matter if you have the access to both hands today, so up to you. We'll begin by just taking your hands on either side of your head. You can have your eyes either closed, or you can just take the gaze slightly off the computer if that works for you. So as you hold the hands on either side of your head, imagine how you are creating the edges of your thoughts by having the hands here, like two parentheses around thoughts. There's no need to take them away, but as if you were holding them with a sense of tenderness or curiosity. And you'll move one hand to the back of the head as if you were cradling it. And then you'll move one hand to the forehead as if you were placing a hand to say it's okay. Notice any softness or newness or tenderness that you can offer. It's often what we would call maybe like a mothering hand or a tender hand or a caregiving hand. It's what we would do to a small child when they're unwell. We would place our hand just lightly on their forehead to check the temperature. What is your emotional temperature right now? Keep one hand on the forehead and then place one hand on the heart. Notice by just placing the hand there, if you can feel any softness underneath the hand. Notice the texture of your clothing, maybe any warmth that exists there. And this connection between the head and the heart. Right? We often equate our heart with the seat of emotions and our head, right, with the more critical thinking. What is it that you need most today to move from your head or your heart? The hand that's on the head will go to the belly. The hand that's on the heart stays there. If you can imagine, as your breath goes in, it moves through the heart and it circulates throughout the body, giving fresh oxygenated blood. Then it comes back out. Our sense of knowing is usually associated with the belly, or that area around the stomach, that gut feeling you get. So imagine as you move from your heart, it's tethered to your intuition. It's tethered to what you know to be true. You'll move the hand that's on the heart to the back of the head. So you have one hand on the belly and one hand on the back of the head. If you were to lie down in grass, right, and put your hands behind your head, it's this idea of feeling calm or contented with the world. It's also holding, reassuring. The hand is at the base of the brainstem, which signals information all the way down to the hand that's on the belly, feeding it information autonomically without you telling it to. It's your body working for your good. And when you're ready, you can bring your hands anywhere you like, whether it's back to the heart, both hands on the belly, hands on the head. So if there was a place that felt the most comforting or soothing for you, and just notice how you feel. When you're ready, you can release your hands and then gently blink the eyes open. If you like, you can type in the chat maybe how you're feeling now compared to when we started our time together today. You could also unmute and share if you like. Relax, centered. And I'll mention this really over and over again as we share time together. Another key element to transformation or change is being able to recognize how we are in the moment, and then recognizing how we are in the next moment. What is the change, if there is any change? It's that ability to recognize a shift that feeds us back into continuing it, wanting to do it again, right? Especially when it's a positive or reinforced moment. Yeah, a lot of groundedness today. Excellent. So my hope and my wish for you today on this Valentine's Day is to really look at this as an opportunity for self-love. And it sounds super cheesy, right? To talk about that, but it couldn't be more truthful, because our capacity to love someone else comes from our capacity to love ourselves, right? And to be generous and kind and compassionate, all of those wonderful qualities. And it spills over, right, when we interact with others. So my hope and my wish for you today is that you spend some time on yourself, for yourself, checking in. And I'm going to email you this check-in list that I had planned for today. So you'll want to make sure that you open that up, and maybe you can spend some time journaling and just checking in over the course of the week. I'm going to go ahead and we'll turn off the recording. And if anyone has any questions or anything they would like to contribute, I'd love to do that.